Welcome to the finance lecture. What if the driverless car did not replace the driver because the driver was inefficient, but because the driver was the last person in the transaction who could see the passenger pretending not to see him? That is the question, not whether autonomous vehicles are impressive. They are. Not whether Waymo is solving a hard technical problem. It is. Not whether self-driving technology can reduce certain risks that come from human drivers. It probably can in certain contexts. The question is colder than that. The question is whether the empty car is actually empty, or whether emptiness is the interface through which a more powerful observer enters the ride. There is a crude version of this conversation that has floated around social media. The crude version says black people are being replaced with Waymos. At first, hearing that sounds ridiculous. It sounds like internet paranoia dressed up as racial analysis. It sounds like something halfway between a joke, a conspiracy theory, and a scene from They Cloned Tyrone. And taken literally, it is not a clean claim. A company does not replace a race with a vehicle. A robotaxi does not wake up and decide to inherit black labor. A labor market is not a meme, but the mistake would be to stop there. A low-resolution statement can be wrong in its literal form and still point toward a real structure. That is the uncomfortable part. Some claims are not accurate photographs. They are thermal images. They distort the shape, but they reveal heat. And there is heat here. Because the driverless car is not only a transportation technology, it is a social substitution technology. It does not merely remove a worker from the front seat. It removes a particular kind of social encounter, a particular kind of witness, a particular kind of discomfort, and a particular kind of personhood from the customer's field of attention. Then it replaces that person with a technical system that sees more, remembers more, and asks for less recognition. That is the hidden transaction. The rider thinks the transaction is this: I paid for transportation without a driver. The deeper transaction is this: I traded a human witness for an institutional witness, and because the human disappeared, I mistook the exchange for privacy. That mistake is the whole architecture. When you get into an Uber or a Lyft, the weirdness of the situation is covered by classification. You're entering the vehicle of a stranger. That stranger has your name. That stranger knows where you are standing. That stranger knows where you are going. Sometimes that stranger learns where you live, where you work, who you spend time with, which hotel you left, which hospital you entered, which neighborhood you want to pass through without explanation. In any other social context, that would be intimate information. But inside the ride-hailing app, the driver is pre-processed before you meet him. He becomes a name, a rating, a license plate, a car model, a little moving icon, an estimated arrival time. The app does not just coordinate the ride. It classifies the person. It compresses him into a service role so completely that the passenger does not have to confront the full reality of sitting in a stranger's vehicle. That compression is not incidental. It is the product. The driver must be visible enough to make the service work and invisible enough not to disturb the fantasy of seamless movement. He must be socially present as a safety signal, but socially absent as a full person. He must be there, but not too there. That is the strange moral geometry of platform service. Now add race. In America, service work has never been just work. It has often been a theater of controlled perception. Who gets to be a customer? Who gets to be infrastructure? Who gets to be relaxed? Who has to read the room? Who can be rude without consequence? Who must manage the emotional weather of the encounter? This is where Du Bois matters, not as a ceremonial quote, not as academic seasoning, but as machinery. Du Bois described double consciousness as the condition of living with two fields of vision: how one understands oneself from the inside, and how one is seen through the eyes of a society that has already classified the body. The standard reading is racial psychology. That reading is correct. But there is another layer that is rarely stated cleanly enough. Double consciousness is also a forced perceptual technology. It is a way of constantly modeling how you are being modeled. It is the second sight produced by exposure to danger, status inequality, racial suspicion, and institutional sorting. It is not mystical. It is not poetic in the soft sense. It is an adaptive intelligence created under pressure. The black driver in a service setting may have to know how the passenger is reading his voice before the passenger knows she is reading it. He may have to know when silence feels threatening, when friendliness feels invasive, when looking in the mirror feels normal, when looking in the mirror feels predatory, when helping with luggage feels polite, when helping with luggage feels too familiar. He may have to manage someone else's fear without being allowed to name that fear. That is labor. It is not on the receipt. It is not in the fare calculation. It does not appear as a line item in the platform's model, but it stabilizes the transaction. This is why the claim about Waymo has an ugly power. The robotaxi is not replacing black people literally. It is replacing a historically racialized service position whose value was partly produced by invisibility, deference, anticipation, emotional containment, and the ability to make another person feel safe while being silently classified as unsafe. That is the high-resolution version. The machine does not inherit the soul of the driver. The machine inherits the market function that the driver's social positioning performed. The passenger still wants movement without obligation. The platform still wants compliance without labor politics. The investor still wants scale without wage friction. The city still wants mobility without admitting that mobility is also surveillance. Waymo enters the space where all of those desires overlap, and the car appears empty. That is the trick. The emptiness is not absence. It is concealment. The driver is gone, but the observing system remains. The human memory is gone, but the institutional memory expands. The awkward person in the front seat is gone, but the sensors, logs, cameras, maps, support systems, route histories, and legal interfaces are still there. The rider receives the feeling of privacy. The platform receives the structure of evidence. That is why this subject feels insane when you first touch it. Not because the crude meme is correct. It is not. It feels insane because the reality underneath it is more sophisticated than the meme. The meme says a race is being replaced by a car. The structure says a social role produced by racial capitalism is being mechanized, sanitized, and resold as privacy. That is worse. To understand the robotaxi, you have to stop seeing it first as a car. That sounds strange, but it is necessary. If you start with the car, you get stuck in the wrong debate. You compare accident rates. You compare convenience. You ask whether LiDAR is better than vision-only systems. You ask whether the vehicle handles construction zones, emergency vehicles, heavy rain, cyclists, pedestrians, and four-way stops. Those are real questions. They matter. But they are not the deepest questions. The deeper question is, what social function did the human driver perform before steering became the only thing we noticed? Because once you ask that, the ride changes shape. The driver was a trust instrument. The driver was a witness. The driver was a class-coded service role. The driver was a liability buffer. The driver was a local intelligence system. The driver was a target for customer frustration. The driver was a disposable point of contact between the platform and the messy physical world. The driver absorbed uncertainty that the app could not cleanly model. The app made the city look programmable. The driver handled the parts that were not. That is the platform secret. Platforms pretend to be software companies, even when their margins depend on messy human improvisation. They present a clean interface to the customer, but underneath the interface sits a layer of human beings solving ugly edge cases. A gate code does not work. A passenger is in the wrong location. A road is blocked. Someone is intoxicated. Someone is crying. Someone tries to bring an unauthorized item. Someone is angry about the route. Someone wants the driver to wait. Someone feels unsafe. Someone is unsafe. The platform's brand stays smooth because the worker metabolizes the friction. This is why service labor is structurally humiliating in a very specific way. The service worker is asked to preserve the customer's feeling that the world is working. When the world does not work, the worker becomes the surface where failure appears. The app does not get yelled at in the car. The driver does. The routing algorithm does not feel the passenger's irritation. The driver does. The pricing model does not hear the complaint. The driver does. That means the driver is not only labor, the driver is a shock absorber. Automation loves shock absorbers because once a shock absorber is identified, capital tries to replace it with something that does not complain about impact. The robotaxi is a shock absorber with no face. That is why the passenger's emotional experience changes. In a human-driven ride, even if you do not speak, the presence of the driver disciplines you. You know another person is hearing your phone call. You know another person can glance in the mirror. You know another person can remember that you were drunk, furious, affectionate, anxious, or exhausted. That knowledge modifies behavior. You become a version of yourself suitable for shared space. In a robotaxi, the body relaxes. That is the product. You may sit differently, speak differently, argue differently, record yourself differently, take a call differently. You may feel that you have moved from public space into private space, but you have not. You have moved into a corporate vehicle whose emptiness is staged by design. This is the first hidden asymmetry. Human observation feels more invasive because it is personal, but institutional observation can be more powerful because it is durable, searchable, combinable, and scalable. A person sees you and forgets. A system sees you and links. A driver may remember a strange ride. A platform can retain trip history, route information, support interactions, vehicle data, account identifiers, payment details, device signals, and inferred patterns. The human witness is socially uncomfortable. The machine witness is administratively useful. People fear the wrong witness. They fear the driver judging them. They do not feel the database absorbing them. That is not because they are stupid. It is because human beings are built to detect eyes, not retention policies. We are socially calibrated toward faces, voices, posture, tone, gossip, shame, and immediate judgment. We are not naturally calibrated toward back-end data architecture, legal process, sensor fusion, retention exceptions, model improvement, or cross-service inference. The robotaxi exploits that mismatch, not necessarily through evil intent. Intent is the weak category here. The structure is enough. A system does not need malice to extract. It only needs permission, opacity, convenience, and repetition. That is the second hidden asymmetry. Convenience is not the opposite of control. Convenience is often the user experience of control working well. The easier the ride feels, the less the rider asks what had to become visible for that ease to exist. Now bring classification back in. Institutions cannot operate without classification. This is not a moral slogan, it is a technical fact. A bank classifies borrowers, a school classifies students, a hospital classifies patients, a police department classifies incidents, an insurance carrier classifies risk, a platform classifies users, workers, trips, complaints, vehicles, neighborhoods, payment patterns, cancellation risk, demand spikes, safety events, and abuse flags. Classification is how power becomes quiet. Force is loud. Classification is administrative. It does not need to shout. It shapes the possible before anyone argues about it. The driverless car is a classification machine moving through a classified city. It classifies drivable space, pedestrian behavior, curb access, traffic signals, construction zones, emergency vehicles, pickup legitimacy, route efficiency, rider behavior, destination regularity, and operational risk. And cities are already classified before the car arrives. Neighborhoods have credit reputations, insurance reputations, policing reputations, school reputations, real estate reputations, noise reputations, crime reputations, delivery reputations, app reputations. Some places are read as markets, others are read as risk. Some curbs are high-value pickup zones, others are operational headache. Some riders are premium demand, others are support liability. The machine enters this pre-sorted world and learns it. That is the part people miss when they say technology is neutral. A model trained inside a sorted environment does not need racial intent to reproduce racial pattern. If the city has already converted race into geography, income, policing, insurance, road quality, infrastructure, service availability, and trip density, then a location model can inherit race without ever using the word race. The coordinates do the dirty work. That sentence matters. The coordinates do the dirty work. This is why the Waymo question is bigger than Waymo. The vehicle is an object lesson in how 21st century power operates. It does not usually say, I am discriminating. It says, I am optimizing. It says, I am improving safety. It says, I am reducing wait times. It says, I am allocating resources efficiently. It says, I am responding to demand. It says, I am ranking risk. And each sentence can be technically true. That is why the most dangerous systems are not the ones that lie all the time. They are the ones that tell partial truths from positions of massive informational advantage. The driverless car is one of those positions. It knows the trip more completely than the rider does. It knows the vehicle more completely than the rider does. It knows the route, the service zone, the account history, the support protocol, the exception policy, the insurance structure, the incident classification, and the legal architecture more completely than the rider does. The rider has an interface. The company has a system. That is the asymmetry. The history of transportation is usually told as a history of machines, horse, streetcar, automobile, taxi, subway, bus, ride-hailing app, robotaxi. That timeline is not wrong. It is just incomplete. The better timeline is a history of who is allowed to move without explanation, who must explain their movement, and who gets paid to make someone else's movement feel frictionless. The chauffeur was never just a driver. The cab driver was never just a driver. The porter on the train was never just carrying bags. These roles sat at the edge of mobility, class, race, and service. They were the people who made another person's movement possible while remaining socially subordinate inside that movement. That is a strange position. You are essential to the trip, and yet excluded from the meaning of the trip. The Pullman porter understood that. The black chauffeur understood that. The airport driver understands that. The rideshare driver understands a late version of it, even when the race of the individual driver changes. The structure remains. One person moves as a customer, the other moves as infrastructure. That distinction matters because American modernity is full of people who are physically present and socially erased. The service worker is in the room, but not of the room. The driver hears the phone call, but is not part of the conversation. The delivery worker enters the lobby, but not the building's social world. The cleaner knows the office better than the executives know it, but is not part of the firm's memory of itself. These are not side details. These are operating conditions. Ride-hailing intensified this older arrangement by adding platform discipline. The taxi driver had local knowledge and some degree of occupational identity. The rideshare driver is wrapped in algorithmic management. The platform sets the price or strongly shapes it. The platform manages visibility. The platform decides which complaint matters. The platform designs the rating system. The platform turns labor into a dashboard. The driver becomes legible upward and invisible sideways. Legible upward means the company can monitor, score, route, deactivate, and optimize the driver. Invisible sideways means the passenger does not have to understand the driver's actual economic condition. The passenger sees convenience. The platform sees a managed labor asset. The driver experiences volatility. This is the bridge between ride-hailing and autonomous vehicles. The platform was already trying to remove the driver before the driver physically disappeared. It first removed the driver's price-setting power, then it removed the driver's dispatch power. Then it removed the driver's customer relationship. Then it removed the driver's local bargaining position. The robotaxi is not the beginning of driver removal. It is the final stage of a process that had already made the human driver structurally thinner. That is why the transition feels eerie. By the time Waymo arrives, the human driver has already been converted into a set of functions: vehicle access, route execution, passenger compliance, local navigation, incident reporting, ambient security, service demeanor. The robotaxi asks which of those functions can be moved into sensors, maps, software, remote support, policy language, and insurance. Most can, not all. That is the part the technology industry often underestimates. A machine can stop at a curb. It cannot yet understand the full social grammar of a curb. It can detect a pedestrian. It may not understand why a teenager is pretending not to cross while obviously intending to cross. It can identify a construction cone. It may not grasp the informal negotiation between a delivery truck, a cyclist, and a police officer waving traffic through a broken signal. City life is not just an environment, it is a negotiation field, but the system does not need perfect understanding to change the market. It only needs enough performance to reclassify the human driver from necessary to expensive. That reclassification is the event. Now bring back the racial claim. When someone says black people are being replaced with Waymos, they are probably not making a careful labor economics argument. They are sensing a substitution pattern. They are sensing that the kinds of human beings historically pushed into service, delivery, driving security, cleaning, and bodily proximity work are now being abstracted into machines. They are sensing that the human discomfort of status inequality is being replaced with the cleaner feeling of technological neutrality. That cleaner feeling is suspicious, not because the machine is secretly racist in some cartoonish way. That is not the claim. The deeper problem is that the machine inherits the city, and the city is already sorted, the maps are sorted, the pickup zones are sorted, policing is sorted, insurance pricing is sorted, credit access is sorted, street quality is sorted, traffic enforcement is sorted, neighborhood reputation is sorted. A driverless system enters that sorted world and learns from it. The machine does not have to hate anyone to reproduce inequality. It only has to optimize inside a world where inequality has already been built into the coordinates. This is why the science fiction reference lands. A film like They Cloned Tyrone works because it literalizes a suspicion that people already carry, that systems can experiment on communities while calling it normal life. The literal premise is absurd. The structure underneath it is not. Public health, policing, housing, lending, schooling, labor discipline, surveillance, and entertainment have all produced real histories where black communities were treated as test sites, extraction sites, or containment zones. The robotaxi enters that symbolic field whether Waymo wants it to or not. The empty car looks clean. The history around it is not. This does not mean every autonomous vehicle deployment is a racial project in the crude sense. It means that any technology that reorganizes urban mobility, labor substitution, sensor coverage, and institutional memory in American cities will inevitably touch the racial order because the city itself is already racialized. There is no neutral street to drive on. There are only streets whose neutrality has been administratively declared. Now we can specify the surface mechanism. The surface mechanism is labor substitution plus data capture under the emotional cover of privacy. Labor substitution is the easy part. A human driver has a cost structure. The driver must be recruited, activated, insured, monitored, paid, disciplined, and replaced. The driver has preferences. The driver can refuse. The driver can organize. The driver can get tired. The driver can complain. The driver can sue. The driver can become the public face of the platform's failures. A robotaxi changes that. The vehicle is capital intensive, but it is institutionally obedient. It does not demand a wage. It does not form a union. It does not interpret disrespect as disrespect. It does not develop local political consciousness. It does not make TikToks about the platform's pay structure. It does not ask why the company is charging the passenger $30 and paying the driver $12. Right. That is the obvious automation story. It is true as far as it goes. It just does not go very far. The less obvious story is data capture. A human driver sees a lot, but most of what the driver sees cannot be converted into institutional memory. The driver may notice that a rider looks upset, that two passengers are arguing, that a neighborhood feels tense, that a route is blocked, that a pickup location is unsafe, that the passenger is trying to avoid being seen. But the driver's knowledge is embodied. It is not automatically standardized. It is hard to query. It does not become a scalable asset unless the platform forces it into a report, a rating, a complaint, or a behavioral metric. The autonomous vehicle is different. Its perception is already machine-readable. Every trip is a data event. Road objects, routes, pickup zones, drop-off patterns, near misses, rider interactions with the interface, support calls, cabin video, demand patterns, time of day, weather, traffic, and destination regularity can be turned into structured knowledge. Again, this is not a claim that the company is doing every imaginable bad thing. Precision matters. The point is simpler. The architecture makes a richer form of institutional memory possible. That possibility changes the economics. The fare is not the only payment. The rider pays with money and with behavioral exhaust. The platform receives the fare, but it also receives training data, operational data, market data, safety data, mapping data, demand data, and perhaps future product data. A low-margin ride can still have strategic value if it improves the system. This is why the normal consumer question, is the ride cheaper, is not the whole question. A subsidized ride may be rational if the missing revenue is compensated by learning. This is the data subsidy. It is not mystical. It is how many modern platforms work. The user thinks the transaction is the visible transaction. The firm knows the visible transaction is also a sensor attached to a larger model. In a human-driven ride, the social cost is the presence of the driver. In a driverless ride, the social cost is the removal of the driver and the expansion of the system's eye. The company sells the rider a solitude premium. You are alone. You control the music. No one talks. No one judges. No one watches in the old human way. But solitude is not privacy. Solitude is just the absence of another embodied person. Privacy is control over information. The robotaxi gives the first while weakening the intuition around the second. Because the rider feels alone, the rider may behave as if unobserved. That is the dangerous psychological inversion. A person behaves differently around a driver. The driver's presence disciplines the passenger. Not legally, necessarily. Socially. You lower your voice. You stop certain conversations. You avoid certain movements. You maintain the minimal performance required by another person's presence. In the robotaxi, that performance relaxes. The rider enters a state closer to private space while remaining inside a corporate sensor environment. That is new. A taxi was public-private. A rideshare was platform-mediated private. A robotaxi is simulated private. It gives the body the feeling of privacy while giving the institution the data conditions of managed observation. That is the surface layer. And it helps explain why the racialized replacement meme has force. The driver, especially the driver coded as socially subordinate, used to absorb the discomfort of urban proximity. He made the passenger feel served. He made the stranger car transaction human enough to tolerate and low status enough to ignore. The autonomous vehicle removes that worker and preserves the passenger's comfort. The rider no longer has to participate in the little rituals of hierarchical politeness. No greeting, no tip anxiety in the same way, no fear of being judged by the person doing the labor. That feels like progress to the customer. It may be progress in some dimensions. I want to concede that cleanly. A driverless car may reduce certain forms of discrimination against passengers. It may reduce harassment. It may reduce drunk driving risk. It may give some riders, especially women or vulnerable passengers, a stronger sense of control at night. It may avoid the racial cancellation problem that has appeared in ride-hailing studies. The strongest argument for the robotaxi is not silly. It is that removing the human driver removes the human driver's biases, moods, and threats. That argument deserves to be taken seriously. But it is incomplete. Removing one human source of risk does not remove power. It relocates power. The question is where. In the robotaxi, power moves upward into the platform, outward into the sensor network, backward into the data archive, and forward into the machine learning system that will shape future rides. The rider has fewer interpersonal risks and more institutional exposure. The worker has fewer opportunities. The city has a new moving sensor layer. The company has a cleaner scaling path. So the surface mechanism is not simply man replaced by machine. It is socially reciprocal observation replaced by one-way institutional observation. That is the difference. Now we can answer the opening question. What if the driverless car did not replace the driver because the driver was inefficient, but because the driver was the last human being in the transaction who could see the passenger seeing him? The answer is that the driver's inefficiency was not only economic, it was perceptual. The driver complicated the fantasy of frictionless service because the driver was a person. A person in the front seat means the passenger is never fully alone. A person in the front seat means the service relation is reciprocal enough to produce discomfort. The passenger sees the driver sees the passenger. Even if they do not speak, there is a mutual recognition problem. The robotaxi solves that problem by removing the person and keeping the function. That is the hidden wiring. The machine is not only a driver, it is a social erasure device. It erases the worker from the customer's field of moral perception while retaining the logistical service that worker provided. In the same movement, it replaces the worker's human gaze with the platform's technical gaze. Less awkwardness, more extraction, less interpersonal friction, more institutional memory. The racial dimension lives there, not in a cartoon claim that a company woke up and decided to replace black people. That is too crude. The racial dimension lives in the historical fact that American service infrastructures have often depended on racialized people performing invisibility for others. The waiter who must not react. The porter who must carry without being addressed as equal. The driver who must make a stranger feel safe while being silently evaluated as a threat. The cleaner who enters after hours and leaves no trace. These roles trained entire populations in the art of being present without imposing personhood. That art has economic value. Platforms rarely name it because naming it would expose the transaction. The worker is not merely doing a task. The worker is absorbing the customer's anxiety about dependence on another human being. That absorption has always been part of service. The more unequal the society, the more valuable that absorption becomes. Waymo mechanizes the absorption. It gives the passenger the benefit that racialized service labor historically provided, movement without social obligation. But it does so through sensors, software, maps, support centers, policy documents, and capital equipment. The worker's double consciousness is not literally copied. The machine does not have a soul. It does not feel humiliation. It does not experience the veil. It does not wonder how it is being perceived. But the system copies the function that double consciousness performed for the market. It anticipates perception. It models behavior. It stabilizes the interaction. It makes the customer comfortable. It reads the environment continuously. It adjusts without asking the customer to understand the adjustment. It becomes second sight without suffering. That phrase is cold, but I think it is accurate. Second sight without suffering. Du Bois described a condition imposed on a people. The platform turns a structurally similar perceptual advantage into infrastructure. And because the machine does not suffer, the customer can consume the benefit without encountering the human cost that once produced it. This is why the empty car is such a powerful symbol. It is not merely that no one is driving, it is that no one has to be socially acknowledged. The passenger gets transported by an apparatus without confronting the laboring body. That is the fantasy of automation in general. Service without servants, production without workers, intelligence without teachers, delivery without couriers, safety without guards, cleanliness without cleaners. But the servant does not vanish. The servant becomes a supply chain, a moderation team, a data labeler, a remote support worker, a warehouse technician, a maintenance crew, a policy exception, a legal clause, a training set, a capital expenditure line, an insurance model. The labor is displaced into places the consumer does not have to see. The most advanced technologies often do not abolish old hierarchies. They aestheticize them. They make hierarchy feel clean. That is the danger inside the Waymo story. The autonomous car arrives as a marvel of engineering, and in one sense it is. LiDAR, radar, cameras, planning systems, simulation, mapping, redundant compute. A serious technical achievement. I do not want to flatten that into critique. The engineers building these systems are solving hard problems, harder than most commentators understand. But a technology can be technically brilliant and socially revealing at the same time. The brilliance does not cancel the revelation. What the robotaxi reveals is that the rideshare driver was carrying more than passengers. He was carrying a social contradiction. The contradiction was this: modern urban consumers want intimate services without intimate obligations. They want strangers to move them, feed them, clean for them, protect them, deliver to them, and absorb their unpredictability, but they do not want the moral density that comes from depending on strangers. Platforms solve this by converting workers into interfaces. Autonomous systems go one step further. They convert the interface into a machine. So yes, at low resolution, the claim is wrong. Black people are not being replaced by Waymos in any clean, literal sense. At higher resolution, the claim is pointing at a real conversion. Racialized human service presence is being removed from the visible transaction, while its stabilizing function is retained, formalized, and monetized by the machine. That is why people feel the uncanniness before they can explain it. The robotaxi is not just a car without a driver. It is a room where the witness has been upgraded from a person into a system. And once that happens, the old question of who is driving becomes less important than the new question of who is being rendered. The street is being rendered, the passenger is being rendered, the neighborhood is being rendered, the curb is being rendered, the informal city is being rendered into training data, compliance data, route data, demand data, safety data, and legal memory. The driver was a person who knew too much and owned too little. The robotaxi is a machine that knows more and owns nothing because ownership sits above it. That is the final inversion. The driver's knowledge died at the edge of his own economic power. The platform's knowledge compounds. It can be reused, sold indirectly through better products, defended as safety, demanded by law enforcement, folded into maps, and used to make the next version harder to compete with. The soul was never in the machine. The soul was in the human system the machine learned how to replace.